Well, we're in the midst of the spring holiday preparation, Passover, de-leavening. If you're not doing anything tomorrow, you're probably vacuuming, I'm assuming. But through this whole process and everything that we do and what God has called us out of, He tells us to remember. And we go back, and if you go back to Deuteronomy 16:3, He tells the ancient Israelites, do the Passover, do this, remember that I brought you out of the land. And that is reiterated again when Christ is instituting the bread and the wine in the New Testament in Luke 22:19, if you wanted to write that down. He says, remember, do this in remembrance of me. And there's a lot of looking back that we're admonished to do. And whenever I think about that, conversations about the ancient Israelites come up, and I'm like, man, they must have been really daft, because we're supposed to look back and we're supposed to remember, and everything in the Bible is written for our example, for our admonition, right? And we look back and we're like, how did they miss it so many times? How did they miss it? And to kind of grasp that they just missed the boat on it. God says to them, these 10 times you've tried me. And I went through, as I was preparing this message, I started all these different things that they did. And it's pretty easy to list a whole bunch of them. And we're supposed to look back, and there's something there that God wants us to get. There's something there. There's a UCG booklet titled, You Can Have a Living Faith. I wanted to read an excerpt about that is an introduction here to what we're going to talk about today. It says, many people believe in God. They assume He exists, although they probably haven't given His existence much thought. But God is not real enough to them, and this lack of reality affects what they think and do. It goes on to say, to believe God, not to believe in God. To believe God, on the other hand, is to have faith that God can and will do for us whatever He has promised to do. God expects us to act on this trusting belief. He requires that we have living faith in His existence, power, and promises. So there's a difference, when we start thinking about what we're supposed to do, what we're called to do. There's a difference between believing in God and actually believing God. And as you look at the ancient Israelites, well, they believed in God. They believed actually in a lot of gods, because they did a bunch of things. They didn't just have the monotheism mentality. They went back to the foreign gods that they had while they were in Egypt. But they didn't get it because they didn't actually believe God. So if you go back in your memory banks, you're like, man, what didn't they get? Well, God protected them from 7 out of 10 plagues. The first 3 they got to have, but once the flies kicked in, God protected them from everything. They got to leave Egypt with a high hand, and they pillaged it wasn't just pillaging. The nation of Egypt gave them things and said, here, take it, get out. We don't want you here anymore. This is horrible. So they were protected. They walked out with loads of cash and everything else, gold and silver. They had a pillar to follow. Then the Red Sea opened, and they walked through on dry land. They got water out of a rock when they were complaining in the wilderness. Oh, you brought us out here to die. When they complained enough about food, because they'd apparently run out, they didn't like eating unleavened bread, and so they complained for food, and God gave them manna. They complained about the manna, and God gave them quail. Moses disappeared for a little while, and they built themselves a calf. They had sandals that didn't wear out, and you're like, how can you be so dense? Well, I'm a dense person. There's a big difference between believing in somebody and believing what they say. That trust, that faith, moving from just believing in to actually believing what somebody does requires a big leap. And that's what we're going to talk about. Because they saw all of that stuff. It's hard to see something and be like, well, yeah, I didn't really think it was real, and then I saw it. My name is Thomas. I put my hand into the hole in your hands and in your side. And okay, yeah, you really are Jesus Christ. I did walk with you for 3.5 years. Okay, I believe you now. We should be able to look. We should be able to see and then believe. So today we're going to look at some of the examples of individuals, well-known individuals in the Bible, renowned for their faith, and what they did as they moved from believing in to full-fledged belief. Because as we're looking back and remembering, as we are going through this process prior to Passover, it's important that we actually remember, because there's a big transition point. After Passover, as we look at the plan of God, there's something that happens at Passover where just believing in something prior to Passover and not transitioning it to believing post-Passover, there's a big difference, because there's a commitment that we remember at Passover. So we're going to look at a few examples of individuals. Let's turn to Hebrews chapter 11. Everybody probably knew we were going to turn there. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8. Hebrews 11, start in verse 8. And here we're starting off with the story of Abraham and his wife Sarah. Abraham, father of the faithful. By faith, verse 8, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Going on about his wife, it says, verse 11, by faith Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Now sometimes we can read through here, and it is very inspiring to read through Hebrews 11, because you read about these people and you're like, yeah. And later on it says, we're surrounded by first verse of chapter 12. We have all of these people that have come before us, and it's exciting. But sometimes we place them on such a pedestal that we forget that they walked just like we do in this life with difficulty, and they didn't just get that miraculous amount of faith or that great level of faith just by virtue of who they were. There's something that has to change in our minds and changed in there. So let's turn back to Genesis chapter 18. Genesis chapter 18. Sometimes it's nice to know that you're in a boat with somebody who actually understands what you think and what you do, and Hebrews goes over a lot of that in regards to our Savior and in regards to Jesus Christ. Here in Hebrews chapter 18, if you're like, well, it's difficult to look at Jesus Christ as an example because he was perfect. Well, here are some people who are listed in Hebrews that weren't perfect, but are listed there as being wonderfully faithful. Genesis chapter 18, verse 12. Now here, the background of the story is that, they had the son of promise that was promised to them, and these men had come and journeyed, and Abraham prepared a meal for them, and they're talking, and they're actually angels here that are visiting. And verse 12, we see here that, we'll start in verse 9. Then the men said to Abraham, where is Sarah your wife? So he said, here in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening in the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? But we just read in Hebrews that it was by faith that she was able to have Isaac. It was by faith. And so going from here to when she actually had him, there was a transition. And while we don't get to see that full arc for Sarah, we do get to see a little bit more of that about her husband. If you turn back a few chapters to Genesis chapter 12. Sometimes in our life, we're willing to give over control, and we're willing to give over responsibility to some other people. And in other areas, we like to hold it very close. And Abraham here is being a human, doing just that. There are areas that we're good at, we succeed, and we're like, okay, I can totally take care of that. This other area, I'm willing to let you do that. You can take care of it. And Abraham is kind of doing that here. Genesis chapter 12, verse 12. So Abraham and Sarah are here in Egypt, and Abraham says to his wife, we're going into Egypt, and verse 11, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore, it's going to happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. So Abraham, when God said, Abraham, he said, here I am. God said, move. He said, okay, I'm going. But he goes into this other area. He's like, well, I've been blessed with this beautiful wife. But having the faith that he's not going to be killed when he goes in to visit this area, that's my life. That's my skin. It's different all of a sudden. And he wasn't willing to have faith in that area yet, right? And if you're familiar with Abraham, you'll see we can turn forward to chapter 20. And we see a repeat of this scenario. Chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. See, in all this time, in between these two, you have the interjected chapter where the men visit, and they promise him a son, and with Sarah, and he intercedes for Sodom. And so all of these wonderful things that are happening in his life here in chapter 20, verse 1, and Abraham journeyed from there to the south and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur and stayed in Gerar. Now Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Sounds very familiar. So there are times in our life where something is just tough to let go of. It's tough to have faith in a certain area. Guess what? The father of the faithful had the same issue. He had the same issue. He had to work up and get to the point where, he was willing to let God be in charge of his life wholly instead of reserving something back and say, well, I'm still the master of this domain. I'm going to take care of this. God, back off. I've got it figured out. But actually in each instance, God had to bail him out and say, no. That's a married woman. Back off. Don't do anything. So God still loved his son, still loved Abraham, bailed him out. And we see over time, Genesis chapter 22, we see a different Abraham here in Genesis chapter 22. Everything that he went through, from being called, separated from his family, having his nephew take the choice land, everything with Hagar and Ishmael, having to wait for a son. And here in chapter 22, it says, now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And Abraham answered, here I am. And he said, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Now, if there's anything a dad likes more than himself, it's his kids. His wife, his kids. He'll do anything for his wife and his kids. And Abraham here, he was worried about his skin when Sarah, when they were going into Egypt, when they were going into Gerar and the different nations, and he just didn't quite have the faith to let God take care of it. Well, over here, it doesn't say, well, Abraham just questioned and he doubted, and he's like, I wonder if God really knows what he's doing. I wonder if, and you see he saddled his donkey, he split the wood, he got the guys. It's a different Abraham here. We'll pick it up. Let's go to verse 6. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, Father, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham didn't make any excuses. This is a man who's speaking with faith, speaking from a point of having that faith, looking forward. And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the 2 of them went together. And he went to the point where let's just keep reading. Verse 9, then he came to a place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. He's going all the way to the point, he's ready to do this deed. And he didn't question God, and he knew, as a new dad, I didn't realize it would affect me this much just reading this passage out loud. But he went all the way up to that brink. And his vision of self-preservation moved from being, okay, I need to make sure I'm all right, to, God's going to take care of it. I don't have to worry about all these other things. I'm going to let that go. I know God is taking care of it. It's approximately, if you go on the short side of time frame, maybe 13 years. It was since the last time we saw a story about Abraham not having the faith there with Abimelech, right? So this is the time of pregnancy, and then 10, 12. Isaac was at least old enough to sit there and haul a bundle of sticks that you need to make an altar. So he wasn't a small kid. But you've got some time here. And God answered his end of the bargain. He said, I'm going to give you a son. Don't worry about it. I'm going to take care of it. And over the process of time, Abraham became this guy that went to the point of killing his only son, or his son of promise, the one that God promised to him. And then the angel of the Lord, verse 11, called out from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. His eyes shifted from just having faith that God took care of him to having faith that God would take care of things. When he's walking up the mountain with his son, and his son asks him, well, what are we going to do about a sacrificial, where's our sacrifice? Where's our offering? He says, God's going to provide. He didn't say, well, I know, in the past God has taken care of things. I'm not really sure what's going to happen this time. He was really good to me over here. You're here now, son, and, but I'd really like to know what he has in store here. No, he says, God's going to provide. And that mindset and that heart that it took to be able to function in this way is what God was looking for. And God says, now I know. Abraham was not a young guy. It took him a while. But God said, now I know. And so we see a different Abraham, the one that we read about again in Hebrews about being the father of the faithful, because that takes a lot. Another individual. Let's go to back to Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to be going back there a few times. Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to start in verse 22. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22. One verse here for this individual, but it says, by faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel, and gave instructions concerning his bones. It's a short passage there, but it sums up a lot about the life of an individual who, when we go back and we read his story, again, had an arc across his life that in the end, when this is what is written. If you could summarize Joseph's life, this is what it says in Hebrews. When you're talking about him and his place with God, it says, by faith, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. And I just think there's so much more there. Let's turn back to Genesis chapter 37. We see a young Joseph here in Genesis 37. Genesis 37, verse 5. Here, again, Joseph is young. He's 17 years old, and he has a dream. Verse 5, now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. First of all, he's daddy's favorite. He doesn't have to go out in the field and work with them. He gets to do whatever he wants to do. He's got a special coat. He tells them about a dream, and he said to them, verse 6, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. Now, there we were, binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. Indeed, your sheaves also stood around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Verse 9, then he dreamed still another dream. And he didn't learn the lesson, because if there's one thing you should do when you have a sibling is to just needle them some more when they didn't like you for the first one. So I would say prudence was not his strong point at this point of the game. He also tells them again. And it's not just his brothers, but it's also his mother and his father. He's bragging about his vision. He recognized it wasn't just a dream. He's telling it to them. Hey, I had this really cool story, guys. It's great. You guys were all bowing down to me. Yeah, how's that? That's a teenage boy, right? Being a teenage boy. So that's a Joseph we're kind of introduced to here. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 45. Again, this is about moving from just believing in to believing God when he tells us something. And God works with us over time, and he works with us where we are to bring us to where we need to be. And everybody has a different arc, and everybody has a different set of trials that they have to overcome. We saw one here with Abraham and his faith for his life, and we see here with Joseph. He went from being a 17-year-old, and over the course of time, he got sold into slavery. First he got stripped, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, wrongfully accused, thrown into prison, held in prison for an extended period of time, and then he came out. And he started serving Pharaoh, still not free per se. But here in Genesis chapter 45, verse 3, we're into the famine, and Joseph has been going back and forth with his brothers, and it's gotten to the point that he has revealed himself to them. And Joseph says to his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. They were, first of all, probably surprised that he was still alive. Second of all, they're like, wait, this is Joseph. Do you remember what we did to him? Yeah, he might have been snarky when he was young, but do you remember what we did to him? They're dismayed. And Joseph said to his brothers, please come near to me. So they came near. Then he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here, for God sent me here. Oh, let me rephrase that. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. It's a big shift in your perspective to go from, if I ever see them again, I tell you, I've got a list. I've written a book about it, right? This human tendency is to figure out how we can be vindictive to people who have wronged us. And it takes a different spirit and a different guide for us to move in the other direction. And here, I bet he had some time to meditate when he was in prison, and there are different things that he was doing, and God was grooming him. But he comes to this point where he's not just sitting there saying, oh, hey, I notice your sheaves are bowing down to my sheaf right about now. I was right. No, he doesn't do that. He says, I recognize that this is what instigated it, but this is where we are, and I recognize that was God's hand. And it's an amazing arc. And so let's turn to go read what Hebrews was referencing. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 50, verse 24 and 25. Genesis chapter 50. Joseph in verse 24 says to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. He's there at the onset, prior to any bit of slavery, prior to any knowledge. I don't know if he knew how long it was going to be, but it's something to be said for an individual who looks into the future and says, this is going to happen. There's no question about it in my mind. It's going to happen, and when it does, do this. Not, hey, if you guys get out of here, please don't forget my bones. No, he says, when you leave, because God's going to come here, and he's going to take you out of this place, take my bones when you go. To have the confidence and the assurance that that was what was going to happen, well, God preserved him, and God brought him to where he needed to be, and he looked at that, and he said, you know what? I'm going to change where I'm looking at things over here, and I'm going to add a different depth to, the relationship that I have with God. He expanded that. Another individual, back in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11, verse 32. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. A lot of amazing feats here. We're going to focus on King David, but you almost could say all of that stuff just about each of the individuals in their own instances, because there were so many things that God worked through them. But we're going to look at David. Let's go to 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel 17, verse 26. 1 Samuel chapter 17, and verse 26. Now we saw with Abraham and Sarah, we saw with Joseph, there are different personalities about, at least when I read the Bible, I read about these individuals, I kind of see a personality start to show, at least with how it's written, kind of individual. And Abraham, he just kept going. And he had to get to the point where he learned what God needed him to learn for God to say, now I know. And Joseph, he had to go through some trials. He had the ups and downs. He's in prison. He had to be ground down to the point that God could use him. And here with David, we see a wonderful example of a young man in chapter 17, verse 26 of 1 Samuel. It says, Then David spoke to the men who stood by him. He's at the battlefield there. He had brought some things for his brothers. He says, What shall be done for the man who kills his Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? And here's the kicker. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? To be young, you end up being a little bit brazen and very, very dogmatic. But David here is just, who is this guy? Yeah, I tend sheep back at home. I take care of things. It may not be glamorous like being in the military, but who is this guy and why is nobody challenging him? There's a lot to be said for that zeal for protecting God's people and that attitude. If you go to 2 Samuel 11, he was David was an all-in kind of guy. When he was listening to God and when he was doing what was right, he was flying high. But he could also drop back down to earth. Icarus flew too close to the sun. He drops back down, and man, when he screwed up, we all get it right here, and we read about it. And you can read through chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, you can see, man, this guy was so zealous for God's way of life. He started off so great. What happened? But then in chapter 12, you see David pick himself up, and he repents. And you can read all of Psalm 51 for repenting for 2 Samuel 11. And you have a guy here that when he messed up, he went back to God. And he may have had a very clear vision. He had the faith that God was going to take care of him. And he did many miraculous actions, from stopping the mouth of a bear, the mouth of a lion, and taking care of his father's sheep, and slaying Goliath. All of these things he did, not questioning that God was going to be there to follow through with it and back him up when he was doing what was right. True faith takes work. When we are going through life, sometimes we can be so focused on the here and now. God wants us to take that and step out of that a little bit at this time of the year. And he says, remember, look back. Look back on what I did. Look back on the kind of individual that you were, or look back on what I've done for the church, or look back on what I've done for my people across these millennia, and realize that it doesn't just happen. But we can kind of sit there and see ourselves in some of these individuals. They're very different individuals in very different times across history, but God worked with each and every one of them. And Abraham, again, kind of a slow plotter, he was an old man when God said, okay, you actually have the kind of faith that you need to have. Now I know, and it's not going to be, I know that you're there with me. I know that you're in my corner. I know that you're really serious about this way of life. And Joseph, again, sometimes we have to go through trials. Sometimes we have to get knocked down a lot because we like to take care of a lot of things, and we just have to figure out how to say, no, okay, God, here you go. Okay, no, God, here you go. I'm not going to try to hold on to that one. And then other times we're like supremely zealous, and then we run into a brick wall and we're like, whoa, what happened? Oh yeah, I got to repent and reset. And then we're supremely zealous, and sometimes we're that kind of a person. We're different people. We have different personalities, but all of us have to work hard at developing a kind of faith that goes from just believing in someone or believing in something to actually believing it. Because when you look, again, going back to ancient Israel, when you look at ancient Israel, they failed to see. They saw, but they failed to move that seeing from just something that I experienced to something that is now driving who I am and what I do. Because I saw this happen, I know that this is going to occur. Because I read it in the Bible, I know that it's true. So we can believe in God, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to change our life. But if we look and we say, no, God, you have blessed me in this way. And many people will tell you, if you talk to someone who's been in the church a while, anyone who's new, God oftentimes starts off and there are miracles and things happen. You're like, how did that happen? It was God. It's a big clue. But and then some of that kind of peters off at the end. And you're like, wow, God, the miracles aren't in my life. Well, read Hebrews 6 and God tells you, grow up, It's time to stop doing this stuff as a kid, and you need to have meat. But he takes us on that journey, and it's our job to say, okay, hey, I saw this over here, and I believe it. And I believe that it's true, and I believe that it's going to happen. And so now, as a result of this, I'm going to change my life in this way. And that's what we have to do. We want to make sure that we're not just seeing and observing and being like, wow, that was pretty cool. Can you do another miracle, Jesus? Right? I like that wine. Make some more. It's not what we're here to do. It's about taking that and using as an impetus for us to become what he needs us to be. So we're commanded during these holy days to look back. We're commanded to remember. We're commanded to meditate on our history. It's our personal history, our spiritual history, the history of our forefathers, as we read in Hebrews 11. Let's turn over to, in closing, the second book of Corinthians. So 2 Corinthians chapter 5. I think it's a very apropos closing here. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Second Corinthians 5, verse 7, very succinctly put. For we walk by faith, not by sight. If everything that we do in this life, we have to see it and touch it to believe that it's actually real or it's actually going to happen, then we're missing the boat. The faith that we have the opportunity to build, and what we're doing during this time of the year, is to look back and to be reminded of what God has done and what he continues to do, and to move that into the future to know that God is going to take care of us.